Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to One Question, the podcast that brings together two Christians and a skeptic in conversation about the state of the world and what justice looks like in practice. Each episode returns to one core question: how do we move from words to actions in ways that actually strengthen community? We unpack what's happening, name the forces behind it, and stay focused on what people can build together. I'm your host, Matthew Brake, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jason Bayless.
Hello.
And Muoki Masao.
What's going on?
And I feel like I usually introduce Muoki first because I feel like I was trying to create a hierarchy and this didn't work. I didn't stick with it. So, friends, thank you.
I don't like change.
I don't like change. Change is terrible. You want to be? Do you want to be at the bottom of the hierarchy now?
I don't want to be a part of any hierarchy.
Well, how are you all doing? Because, I don't know when last episode and this episode are going to come out, but there's actually been a little break here just because schedules got in the way. Muoki, I know you're working hard. Jason, I don't know, you're always doing something. I've been working, but our boy dog passed away last weekend, so we had to push back recording. So that was sad. I was actually surprised how hard I took it. I was still going to try to make the podcast, and Jason texted and was like, this pain won't last just for an hour, like take the day, which I was really surprised because I haven't owned or had a pet or an animal that died in my care since I was 7. So as a grown man, I was bawling my eyes out for this dog. So I was, in fact, my future stepson-in-law made the comment. He's like, only 2 things can make me cry: someone losing their dog and a grown man crying. He's like, and I looked at Matt, and he was a grown man crying over losing his dog. So he too was joining in our tears.
Tough
We need
moments.
that. We need that.
So it was, but I'm glad to be back together with you fellas. Like I said, I've missed my screaming into the pillow podcast. Yeah. Which out of context, I realize sounds kind of weird, but if you heard
that definitely does sound weird.
sound weird, right?
I'm gonna exit stage left now.
we can take care of it in the editing process. So last time we were together, 2 episodes ago, Muoki had told his story, particularly of his missionary experience in Africa. And then I was telling sort of my story, sort of walking through different parts of my Christian life and how my understanding of justice and public action has changed over time, and talked about growing up in the Christian right. I believe I got to the point of talking about going to Regent and coming to a place of being affirming of LGBTQ people, which really only brings us up to the late 2000s, early 2010s. Like, there's been like a whole journey since then. So I wanted to return to that just because I think some of the thoughts I've processed here, some of the different groups I've been a part of, might help us think about what justice looks like in public a little better. So that's my plan. So I believe last time we joined our heroes, I was talking about, like I said, the LGBTQ affirmation process I went through. I think also that was sort of at the end of me talking about my movement out of the Christian right, which was in part inaugurated by having been a big George W. Bush supporter and having grown disillusioned. And I don't remember if I talked about this last time, but as it became apparent that Iraq was going to crap, I sort of ran into this problem where I was like, well, something obviously needs to change. A message needs to be sent. But like I was always told, voting for Democrats was evil.
Right.
And yet that's really the only way you can really hold accountability. And I feel like what you see now in terms of a lot of Christians in this country, particularly evangelicals in their practice, is that they refuse to hold their own political party accountable because that would mean voting for the other side. So any evil is justified by their own party because they won't bring themselves to hold their own party to account by voting for the other side. It's seen as an unthinkable option. And that's just absurd to me. That's a nice way to allow corruption to fester. So that's where I'm coming from. Like, voting for Democrats was unthinkable. And so I found myself in this place where I recognized that my own side didn't produce some sort of greater holiness, justice, that they were just as capable of being corrupt and incompetent as the Democrats I was raised being told were corrupt and incompetent. But I couldn't bring myself to vote for Democrats either. So I was always looking for a third way. And I found it, and I think a number of evangelicals like me who grew disillusioned with the Bush administration found it in some of the teachings of neo-Anabaptism. So Anabaptism is a peace tradition within Christianity that the Amish are one version of this. And think about what the Amish do. They live in their own community according to their own values, and they don't participate in the politics of greater Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And they're a peace tradition, so they don't engage in war either. They take those teachings about turning the other cheek very seriously. Now, there are other groups of Anabaptists. Mennonites are another one. There are peace traditions like, I believe it's the Brethren in Christ and a few others that, Quakers obviously would also fall into this, although I don't think they're not coming from the same Anabaptist root. I don't think, again, this is where I might show my ignorance as a church historian. But with the neo-Anabaptist, I'm calling it that because basically you have these evangelical Christians who are still largely holding to evangelical forms of worship practice and small o orthodox theology and a desire to evangelize. But in adopting neo-Anabaptism, they decided to focus on the community of the churches they were in as a model and witness of an alternative community based on, among other things, the teachings of Jesus. And understanding all worldly politics as something corrupting. And the comparison used, and it was once I certainly used, was that of the Jewish people in Babylonian exile. Like, the Jewish people weren't trying to, Christianize Babylon. Well, obviously not Judaize Babylon. Babylon, in fact, is the symbol in the entire scripture of worldly empire. And so the church is meant to be something that's the opposite of the worldly empire. So rather than ruled by the sword, it rules by peace, and rule might even be a strong word. It engages in practices of peace and egalitarianism with each other in an alternative politics. And so that's what I adopted for a while. And that allowed me to avoid having to engage in the either or party system. And Jason, I think we had a few conversations during this time. I think, this sort of overlapped with the previous podcast we did, Coalesce. This idea of an alternative community that isn't trapped in the binary of the two-party system of U.S. politics. And so I embraced that for a long time, where I saw that my focus was on the local group of people I was in community with and serving my local neighbors around me. So it was also very local. It was very communitarian, so voluntary buy-in, and then this push to have each member recognize and then take the initiative in taking care of needs in the community and so forth. So that's where I lived for a long time. And that overlapped also with ideas about Christian anarchy. Again, the idea that Christians are part of a alternative community, an alternative politic that serves as a witness to a different way of being in the world that, among other things, doesn't involve coercion or the sword. And so that's where my head was at, and I lived there. And I actually think in some ways, for a little while, I became someone who might have been able to be an honest broker with like conservative and liberal friends online, because I would play this antagonistic role to both sometimes, where for the liberals, it was like, you don't recognize how neoliberal you are. The progressives, you don't realize, putting an LGBT sticker and BLM sticker on a missile that's getting dropped on collateral damage doesn't make it justice. Like, there are some real inequalities present that Democrats support too. And for conservatives, I mean, particularly when Trump got in office, it really became low-hanging fruit. But I felt like I was an equal opportunity offender in that regard. See, you know, when Trump got elected, I remember I was with a group of progressive friends who were very upset. And I was sort of in a place of, it wasn't glee, but sort of antagonistic glee at how big of a deal they were making it, because it's like we would preach in our church about the fact that all worldly politics were corrupt. And so for me, it was like you're making, you know, it was like that Dave Chappelle sketch on SNL when Trump got elected the first time, when him and Chris Rock are sitting on the couch and all the white people are freaking out. They're like, guys, I think America might be racist. And they're just like, yeah, maybe. Not that Chappelle, you know, there's some issues with Chappelle, but so that's where I lived for a while. And I don't know, Muoki, if you relate to that. Jason, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that type of mentality. Like there are things about it I see as problematic now. There are times where I do miss it. I miss being able to hold myself above the need to pick between lesser evils. The fact that now I do make certain decisions where I will support what I think is the lesser of two evils. But for a while there, I really bought into that idea, church is alternative community, and being able to sort of put myself above the fray of partisan politics. That's where I landed for many years. I mean, many, I'm, 41, but at least 7 years. 8 maybe. So I don't know if you have any thoughts. I don't know if there are criticisms.
Yeah, and the big thing that comes from me is when my family came to this country, all growing up, in the suburbs, it was like the white kids they were just, oh man, this is a cool kid from Africa. But then with the Black American kids, that's where the majority of the racism or like the racist experiences I had growing up was from Black Americans, because I was not that. But then when I went to church, and I was now in a Pentecostal conservative church where it was filled with many African, descendant people and not many domestic Black Americans. It's in that space then where it flipped, where all the Black jokes, it almost like it was like these white guys and white girls had this free pass to essentially just give any Black joke they ever wanted, anything they ever want to say Black, they could just, because he's here and we're Christians or whatever, just Muoki this, Muoki that, you're the. And so it was super disorienting for me growing up. But then when I got older, and I remember one time I was sitting at a stoplight. This was when I was getting ready to get out of college, and I was at a stoplight close to where my parents lived at the time in the suburbs of Northern Virginia, man. This is not like Southeast DC or Baltimore. Very little goes on around here at the time. And I heard a siren go off, and I don't even know where it was. And when I tell you that the first thought in my mind was man, what do I need to do so that if these police run up on me, that I make it home to my parents? I was mind you, I live in the suburbs of Northern, that stuff doesn't, but why is that? That was my first thought. And so it's when Bush got administrated, whatever, it was what it was when Obama got in. It's just never been a big thing for me, seeing that as anything that leads to a more quote unquote Christian way of being. It doesn't lead to more equality or equity or any shalom. I think shalom is a better word because it doesn't have to do with the two-part system or whatever. It doesn't lead to more homeless people being able to eat or there being less homeless people at all. And what's been fascinating for me is, again, Northern Virginia, suburbs, whatever. I remember in my little town, this BLM rally a few years ago came up. And I'm first thought was was there a BLM rally in the whitest part of town? And why are people showing up? And it's this thought that for a lot of people, fighting for justice is just an option. It's just another thing you can. It's like you're at a buffet for life, and it's like, okay, today I'm going to fight for justice. Tomorrow I'm going to save the whales. Tomorrow, the next day, I'm going to look for like sustainable like farming, and it's just another one of the options. But at the same time, one of the reasons why I love about this podcast and this conversation we have is like some things are just non-negotiable. Like what we got going on right now, this should not be an option that you can say, I follow Jesus and, well, this is okay. Or, you know what, like it's better than the alternative. Like that is not a thing. And that to me is what has been so hard as I've gotten older in this country. Now that I'm a family man, I have a son, he's biracial, but let's be real. Everyone is cool with biracial kids until there's a problem, and then you're the black kid. I don't care who you are. That's how it goes. Bonhoeffer has this wonderful sermon that he preached on. It was a national holiday in Germany, and he said that as Christians, if you believe in Jesus, you have to have something to say that is not like what everyone else is saying. Regardless of where they are, left, right, center, middle, up and down, back to front. You have to say something that's totally different. That's the word. That to me is what the word of the Lord is. And the problem for me right now as I get older and I see is like everything just sounds the same. And one of the reasons why I love James Baldwin is because he was tapping into that. He was tapping that something. What is the different word, different message, different perspective that you can have? And even Martin Luther King is the same way. Not the sanitized version or whatever. Like Martin Luther King's sermons are so powerful. And if you read the transcripts, this dude is preaching straight up hot fire.
Moke, what you're saying, two parts of what you're saying. One, when you talk about wanting to hear something different, I mean, I do think, going back to the Anabaptism thing, I mean, one thing that is, as I learned from some more real Anabaptists, I mean, Anabaptists aren't meant to be totally passive. Like, Anabaptism is a nonviolent resistance group, right? So there is that nonviolent resistance aspect. And I do think there were some, because the church I was involved in. Like, there were some things that we were able to do. Like, we could critique Obama's collateral damage and war and use of drones and things like that. We were also able to critique and just, we were able to critique Trump. And there were people who thought we were being kind of harsh on him because they were coming from this place where, as conservative Christians, like, you don't critique the Republican person. And we were able to critique him, but they could never say it was because we were Democratic psyops or whatever. Same thing with, in our critiques of capitalism, which we gave pretty often, how the capitalist profit motive is not the way of the church or of the people of God or the people who claim to follow Jesus and create a community around that. We would go after communism too, mainly, for the fact that it becomes hierarchical, particularly when you're looking at Stalinism and Maoism. Like, it becomes this hierarchical thing that treats the people it kills as sort of the refuse of history in the name of a greater good, right? And so we were able to call these balls and strikes well. But to your other point, there is a sense in which, in the thing, I read a piece by, and this guy too, Jack Holloway.
Oh, he's the man.
I think he was taking some classes at Union Theological Seminary, reading a lot of Black theology, but particularly Malcolm X.
Yeah.
And his point, I remember he wrote this piece critiquing Anabaptism, particularly evangelical neo-Anabaptism, because in some ways the choice, because like the big thing neo-Anabaptists would focus on, I'm thinking about people like Greg Boyd and others, not voting. Because voting itself is also a form of coercion by the majority over the minority. So Anabaptism, if you really want to push the peace tradition, no coercion at all. And so voting is a form of majoritarian coercion. So those of us who adopted that view were very anti-voting. And I wrote this piece that Jack wrote that involved talking about Malcolm X, how for Black communities that have lacked power, to ask them to not vote isn't, is taking away the only power they have. What for me as is a choice.
That's right.
For others is a matter of like, it's a limited tool, but it's the only tool they have, and we take away even that. I think that's what began pushing me in a bit of a different direction, out of that Anabaptist, and along with that sort of like a form of Christian anarchy and Anabaptism that was representative in a lot of the people I was hanging around with at the time.
And so, Jason, like, I'm like very curious what you have to say, just because I think a few conversations ago you talked about being at a Black Panther anniversary party. Like, in my mind, I've had a lot of respect for the Black Panther Party and what I've heard that their legacy was, that's been covered up or whatever you want to call it. But for me, it's that aspect of, is it Du Bois who's the one that said like why I'm not voting? Was it him or Frederick Douglass? It was one of those guys.
Oh, I'm not sure.
The why I'm not voting, like there is a Black tradition that goes in that direction. However, at the same time, at some point you just have to get on with the business. And that's just the way, to me, the way it goes. But I think what I loved about the Black Panther Party, but even about the civil rights movement and even how they went about business, was like, you have to do something in the world to actually activate whatever kind of justice you want to bring about. I think for me with the Anabaptist and all that, what's there's the great things about them, but the hard part is like, where is the momentum that can be built that can trickle down enough to like raise up the people that are below. So, the people at the margins, the lower classes or whatever you want to call them, that they have enough momentum to, not saying that you have to like free them completely, but like there can be some like effects or after effects of their political action. And this is the thing, like, bro, Matt, you know this, growing up conservative Christian, white conservative Christian, that politics is, we have to like have a theology of politics. Man, Black people just were political. That's just how you were. You don't choose, let me figure out my theology of politics. He's the God of the Exodus, who's bringing out of, like, the liberation is socioeconomic, it is political, it is theological, it's totally embodied. There's no separation. That's how Black people understand it. Whereas a more conservative white way of looking at it would be like, it's like a compartment. But as Bonhoeffer says, God calls the complete person. He doesn't call a part of you. He calls the whole person. Anyways, the point is about action. There could be a lot of ways to parse it, but at the end of the day, you just have to get in the ring and fight. And at this point, after looking at Radical Guide and the Anarchy, all that, Jason, I need to know about like action. Like how is with all of what Matt said and I've said and all that, what makes you take action? And how do you make it so that like whatever you're doing has like effects for people that are, if you want to call it a class, in a class setup, lower or at the bottom or whatever, to, if not raise them up, at least make their lives better in some kind of a way.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to answer your question right off. I might loop around a bit to get to it. Because there's a lot on the table right now between both of you. So what I'm saying is not a reflection of the groups or the people that you've mentioned or you as individuals. It's a broad stroke looking kind of that framing to get to the specifics. So don't think I'm talking about one specific group or people or anything. It's more of a broad stroke narrative that I'm about to bring. Well, one, for me personally, just to start there, I don't have a belief that I could ever free anybody, liberate anybody. Mm-hmm. It is not something that I carry. It is not something that I produce. It is not something that I create. It is something that I think you said earlier around bringing your whole body, your whole self, your whole thing to something. That is the path forward. And, and the examples that y'all gave of all the different groups, those are manifestations of people showing up in that way. And that's, again, a broad stroke because there's nuances and brokenness and within all that. The thing that I would want to bring to the conversation, that bring it back to what Matt was saying earlier, is the different thinking that is needed, at least for our conversation in our position where we are in this podcast, is within the spectrum of change. Because again, broad stroke, not saying this is what you said, but broad stroke, Matt, moving from the mindset of I was a hardcore nationalist and I would not entertain the idea of the Democratic Party. I would not vote for them because it gave evils. And then the transition of change to say, oh, I no longer see that, but I'm still giving value to the whole system of both Republican and Democrat, is an illusion of change. Because you're still contributing to an oppressive and destructive system within that. And again, this is a broad stroke. This is not targeting you because you're like, you acknowledge and recognize that was still not enough. I needed to look at alternatives within that. What are other groups doing? What are other traditions doing that break that? I think where we as organizers and even as people just trying to make change in the world, you don't even have to be an organizer, where we fall in the trap is when we're given the choice is like, there is no, the statement that you made earlier, there's no alternative. That is deeply rooted in white culture, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying that. And that is what consciously and unconsciously in areas keeps us from moving outside of the binary system, where we think, oh, if we just support Democrats, then we can make systemic change that would actually talk about the things that we've spoken about in this episode and previous episodes of like truly embodying what it means to be a Christian, or truly embodying that holistic aspect of liberation or justice. We stay trapped into continuously defining it within the parameters set for us, not parameters that we set, but that was set for us within that two-party system. Even in the nonviolent resistance of the system to be critical of the system, and should I vote or should not vote, is also in the kind of what we talked about maybe in episode 1. It's a framing of the question where the answer still plays in part of the benefit of the system.
Yep.
We haven't, in our conversation, we haven't broken out into the true alternative yet. We're still in the same system. And to go back to the question is like, as an anarchist, as somebody who does this work from that, what it's not a specific of what I do. It's how I look at things and how I question it. Is like, is this really pushing that boundary? Is it really stepping outside, or is it an illusion that we're still within the system? There's an organization called CELDEF, which is Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, I think, if I have the name right. They have what they call a democracy course. And within the democracy course, they talk about state preemption. They talk about federal state preemption and the impact of it. And they have what they call as a box of allowable actions. And we're taught as organizers and as citizens to the only acceptable methods of change are within this box. Anything outside of that box is unacceptable. And that is so insidious that we all believe that. And even if we don't visually recognize it, we operate from that space, and we have to get out of that box of allowable action to be actually to make systemic change that we're speaking about. And that's not to say that the work that the groups that we've talked about that are within that box are not doing great things. It's a recognition is not enough and we need more. And that recognition is what gives us the access to be in different conversations and show up differently so that we can actually manifest something differently. So I'm going to stop rambling and give space for feedback or commentary.
So Jason, one thing I'm curious about, because this is something I've wrestled with, because, the end of the story is basically that the end of Trump's first term was I sometimes refer to it as my Bonhoeffer moment. He has this whole thing on responsible action. Like, you can't focus on your ideological, political, ethical purity. Like sometimes, like we're going to get our hands dirty. Right? Like, we can't be so pure in our attempts to find justice that we don't take responsible action, which means, we might end up being guilty of a lack of purity or making mistakes, but he really pushes this idea of responsible action. So I voted against.
Matt, before you move on, can
Yeah.
you, because I think you can articulate this better than I can. Just what is this, Jason? Are you aware of this Bonhoeffer moment concept? And can you just like in plain, because the thing is, and it's funny bringing it up because Metaxas he brought up the Bonhoeffer moment. I think it was before Trump's first term, or like very early on. For most people who, if you've just read Cost of Discipleship, they hear Metaxas say Bonhoeffer moment, and they hear American evangelicalism, not necessarily Bonhoeffer himself and how he understood it.
Yeah, which I mean, the Bonhoeffer moment for me also ties well into, in some ways, the Kierkegaardian leap of faith. That, something that I can't probably square the circle between what I think perfect theology and Christian practice is, and what I feel needs to be the case. For me, it was voting in the face of this strong neo-Anabaptist view. I mean, for Bonhoeffer, it was the commitment to nonviolence, and then his willingness to join an assassination plot against Hitler in some shape or another. And so when I think of Bonhoeffer, like that moment that takes you out of your ideological purity and you end up doing something, you end up taking responsible action in a way that violates that purity. Now, again, for me, it was voting for Bonhoeffer. It was, and people debate about what his role in that was, and if there was a role, but the general idea is he's associated with this group that wants to assassinate Hitler. And so, and that's that form of responsible action where you leave that ideological purity behind. And for me, I did sort of see Trump as an example of taking away. I mean, there was this reaction to BLM, the way he handled the pandemic. There were a lot of things that were going in there. And even now, like looking at what he does, the Anabaptist in me, the Black liberation reader in me looks and goes, yes, I know the system was corrupt, but some of the stuff was worth keeping that he gutted. And what the hell is happening here? Which is why, and Jason, maybe you can speak to this about how to, because you bring up a good point that even with that Anabaptist stance, there was still something about it that was still maybe not enough, maybe not totally outside the system. Like, it's hard for me to always imagine outside of the system. Like, I would probably place myself now in a sort of social democrat field where I would recognize that maybe some more radical justice is great to pursue, even as harm reduction might require, voting for the lesser of two evils. Like, I've been embracing Reinhold Niebuhr, and like one of the things that, and Niebuhr's a complicated figure, but he does talk about the problem of the lesser of two evils. Like, yeah, the British Empire was bad, but the Nazis were worse. So support the British Empire against the Nazis, and then when the Nazis are gone, return to critiquing the British Empire. Like, I want to live in that place, and I'm trying to live in it without becoming just another Democratic Party guy, which is what Niebuhr became. Like, Niebuhr he goes from being a socialist to basically just a mainstream vital center Democrat, and losing that ability to think outside of that box, at least until the very end of his life when he goes against Vietnam. And this is all, I'm getting all this from Gary Dorian because I've been listening to him recently. But, and I'm wondering, Dorian talks about things, and I'm all on board. I'm all about, he has the list of the social democratic rights that we all have to retirement, a living wage, education, healthcare, a clean environment. And then even as you pursue those things, you always pursue greater democratic, socialistic, economic democracy. And I'm curious to hear what you would think of. For Dorian, it's hard for me when I hear Dorian talk. He's made these comments that, a lot of organizing is just survival, because real progress is only made when you have organizing along with liberal ascendancy. And so it's like, can you imagine it? Yeah, I was wondering if there would be because he's thinking about like the 60s where you had the organizing and then this particular liberal ascendancy moment, even though it was joined with other things like Vietnam. And if you don't have that liberal ascendancy, it's all survival and waiting for the next moment, right? That's sort of his take. And it's hard for me not to sort of feel like I'm being a Niberian realist and thinking maybe that's the best we can hope for. I think about when Cornel West talks about how you don't want to be like a party man, but you still might work with the party that you think will be more likely to work with you on your goals. I think about this Christian anarchist I heard on a Homebrew Christian podcast where he's like, you pursue alternative forms of justice and more radical forms of justice, even while you might participate in a system in a harm reduction way. And so you're like building this alternative within the husk of this dying, unjust thing. And I'm hearing all these thoughts and I'm wondering, I saw you cock your head a few times. I'm wondering how you're processing this. Basically, I don't want to stop imagining for something more than just social democratic reformism, but it's hard for me to imagine outside of that.
Yeah.
I think that's the keystone to it all is like none of us can see something that we haven't seen before.
Yeah.
And so if our imagination is not allowing us to see something, it's just because we haven't had the experience or saw somebody else do it or saw something that inspired something bigger. And that's normal. And I think there's benefit in, well, maybe back up real quick. Going to your statement about there's good things and bad things within the system, and but you don't know how to work within that to get to alternative or outside of that system. I think that falls also into the domain of purity, because we're looking at things when we say that, and when we're like thinking that we have to disband everything to get something new. We're looking at things in a binary scenario instead of actually looking at what is actually serving. I mean, a good example was like what you were saying is like around the survival organizing. I think the question that I would have is like, who is defining survival organizing? Is it somebody coming from a privileged space that has the ability to choose what is survival and what is not? Or is it somebody really organizing for their full-on survival? And I think that exploration is going to highlight and show something really transparent to the answers that you're seeking. Because to say that people who are organizing around survival are just waiting for the next crisis or the next thing, I don't know the context in which they said it, but just hearing that raises a lot of flags for me, because I'm like, really, do you really think people who are starving and fighting to get food are waiting for the next thing? The fucking thing that they're waiting for is their next meal. And so to put them in a box to say that they're just doing this to pass the time or to apply that is really undermining the real issue there that these people are experiencing. This goes back to what we said so far in every episode. Liberation looks different for everybody. And so when I hear a statement like that throws a flag for me, because what they said about survival, it throws a flag for me because they're defining liberation for somebody. They're defining survival for somebody. They're not in a conversation is like, what is needed, what is actually happening. Let me get full understanding so that we can collectively make a decision to move forward. I've never seen survival organizing, and surviving organizing. I don't even know why I've adopted that term from this. You said that, but that's not a thing. Survival organizing for survival is.
I want to clarify what they mean by survival. I think it's the idea of keeping ideas of greater economic democracy and social democracy alive. Like you're keeping the idea of that greater amount of economic justice and economic democracy, because it's specifically geared around like organizing towards social democracy and democratic socialism, and keeping the ideas of those things alive. That you're basically organizing to sort of keep the idea there, but it really only gets enacted in these moments of liberal ascendancy. I think that's a little bit different than the idea of like organizing to make sure people can eat literal food to survive. I think that might be a different way the cause is being framed. I don't think he means literally like hey, sometimes you just survive, and one meal a day. I don't think I don't
Yeah.
think that's what he's. So I want to be clear. I do want to clarify that.
All right, that didn't clarify anything for me, but I accept the. So I'll move on because there's context missing here, and I'm arguing against a void. So let me move on.
Should have taken the class, bro.
Yeah, but I've lost the train because I got rabbit hole on that. So I'm going to stop and let's see what happens.
Well done. Well, I think, again, this problem of what can I realistically believe for? Oh, you were talking about institutions not feeling like we have to fall into the binary of either eliminating all these institutions and creating all new ones, that like we can still keep some of this stuff.
Well, yeah, because what I was saying was like that is also that binary is problematic because generically speaking, that is an answer that stays within the solo or the individual or a small group. When you're like everything that we've always talked about in these episodes, it's about being in conversation with the community that you're with to figure out what is needed. So in that dialogue around what is needed to truly bring forth, embody liberation, to create a better world, to step outside the box, whatever qualifier you want to put on that, is going to put pressure on what works and what doesn't work. If we're truly asking the question is like what works and what doesn't work, and you're going to find out at this point in time, because we're on a spectrum, at this point in time, these good things of the current system is beneficial for us. So we need to keep them until we can actually develop something better, or keep them and change the power dynamic that's within it. Because in this two-party system, the root cause of everything is power dynamics. Who has the power? Who's making the decision? Who's benefiting from that? And when you're in conversation with community trying to build something better, if you're not pinpointing the power dynamic on that, then it's hard to say that you're making systemic change. You may be making change, but it might be a change within that same box. But when you start challenging power and looking at power dynamics and shifting that, that is where kind of start stepping outside that box, because then you're just like saying, well, these banks are funding war, these banks are funding all of these things. Instead of voting the right people into power that are going to be in bed with the banks, why don't we create a different system that we don't rely on these banks anymore? Or that we create a different system that actually takes away the power dynamic from the people who are producing this most destructive element that we're talking about. In that conversation, the community say, we may not be ready to move away from banks, but here's the things that we can put in our community that lessens our dependency on the bank. And that's where you start pushing outside of the box. And you have to be aware of co-optation. You have to understand how the capitalist system works, because anytime you become effective, those who fear losing power or position are going to be pushing back hard. And that shows up in a lot of different ways. So one more thing about capitalism and I'll shut up. You said earlier that, it's capitalism and then you switch to communism. Capitalism is not exclusive to democracy. Capitalism shows up in all those different things.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole conversation about, the state-run capitalism of China. We could talk about the sort of move towards this weird libertarian authoritarianism of like Peter Thiel and folks like that, who, what is it? Thiel said that democracy and freedom are no longer compatible, by which he meant, by freedom, he means capitalist freedom. Yep. Because women don't vote the way he wants them to. So yeah, no, I think is it Quinn Slobodian who has a book, I think it's Cracked Up Capitalism, where he basically says we're starting to see a decoupling between capitalism and democracy. So yeah, no, that's a completely fair point.
Cool.
Yeah.
What else we got?
Well, I was thinking about, again, because right now, like my head is in this social democratic space, Weirdly enough, I think it was Joe Biden who helped push me in this direction. I remember watching his debate with Paul Ryan, and he made this comment about Social Security, that it needed to be a guarantee and not subject to the fluctuation of the market, which made sense to me because I lived through 2008 and I could see where, rather than having someone's retirement fluctuate and go down, because a lot of people were losing money in their retirement in 2008, that, yeah, having some sort of bottom line guarantee, even if it's not the greatest sum of money in the world, you can at least depend on it not going down if there's a market fluctuation. And I think from that idea of, I think that's sort of built in my mind to the idea of public goods. Like I do think I've become a full-fledged social democrat here, which again is why I struggle with, because it's like social democracy like would make life better for a lot of people. But I also recognize that you're still dealing with, I mean, this is again why I think people push towards democratic socialism, a la King and others, because then there's also the worker involvement and ownership of private capital so that they can determine their own lives and not be, because I mean, basically corporate America is this, it's basically monarchy by another name in terms of how workers and bosses act towards each other.
Yeah. And
So, yeah.
I think this is a great example of looking at what works now and what doesn't work, and to bring in the conversation, because we could easily stay within the box and say, yes, we need universal income, we need the government to provide all these things, and that universal health care and all that, and that would be great, and we should do that. That should happen. We should have that. And there's something in there that we need to also inject in the conversation, not to stop the flow, not to stop the getting everybody what they need, but to really bring in an aspect of it's like, because of the way our system is currently set up, that we see how fast things can change, how quickly those can be taken from us, taken away from the people. We've seen how quickly the Voting Rights Act has been gutted, that's been removed. So this goes back to that idea that you brought up, is like, I want to do this, I see the flaws in it. So the question then becomes is like, yes, let's get those things for the people, but let's also build something when somebody else is in power and strip it away. They can't take it away. And that's not legislation. That is not laws, on the books. That is what you build as a community. That is the culture and the coming from and the foundation in which we see ourselves in this world, how we participate in this world. And that again shows up in a lot of different ways. We talk about anti-fascism throughout history. The work of anti-fascists really come from that space. The world that we want has no place for this type of rhetoric or this way of view. So we're not ever going to give it a platform because it doesn't produce something better. And that is the social contract, for lack of a better way of saying, that we hold each other accountable to. We don't let things that drift us apart seep in to drift us apart. So yes, universal health care, universal income. Let's get that things to take care of people, because that frees up so much of us, that improves the lives of so many people. But let's not stop there. We have to start building the infrastructure of the people that we name on this podcast that have these great visions of the world it is. That requires that community. That doesn't require pockets of community. That requires the whole community. And it starts locally.
So this reminds me, this almost actually makes me think it's a supplement to my neo-Anabaptist church days, where it was like, the mistake wasn't creating a local community. The mistake was maybe withdrawing from those bigger systems too. I guess what I've been coming to peace with, I totally agree with this idea of, building an alternative within the husk of this system, which can be just today and unjust tomorrow, right? Like, I think that's a fair point. So maybe the mistake in the in certain parts, I think Black Anabaptist, like Drew Hart, get this a little better. But yeah, I think that's a good point. It makes me think, I read a book by Mark Lila, and I don't know a lot about Mark Lila. I've heard some people critique him. I don't know if there's a there, so I'm not going to touch it. But I did read this book where he talked about the problem of like movement and local movement. So like stuff like protest and organizing being seen as a binary like difference with actually having the institutional power to change policy.
Yeah.
And I guess in my head, there's a lot of that makes sense. And I guess I would see it as complementary to your point that you do. I mean, and I think part of what he's critiquing, and Jason, I'm sure you would appreciate this, would be, we've seen a lot of protest movements over the past decade. But I think one critique of those is there hasn't been the type of organizing that like MLK calls for, where it's like, okay, you can show up to the protest, but you have to do that hard organizing work every day in your, in the places where you live, outside of just the protest. Otherwise, it's a flash in the pan. So I think part of it is how we think about movement work, because I think a lot of people think about the protest. They don't think about the organizing and community building. In some circles I've been that talk about it, I'm sure, I know that that's part of it. So not only do I think some people's ideas of movement work needs to be expanded, but I would say that I'm coming to peace with the idea that maybe that needs to be supplemented with actually some contact with those with institutional power to actually implement policy, even though that policy can be changed with the new administration and those things can be taken away. Like, do we find, like, should we pursue that both and, to your point, like, yes, pursue these things, but also have that alternative local community structure for when those things fail? Is that the way we should think about this?
Well, I think that's binary thinking as well. But let me back up before getting into that.
Damn it.
Well, going back to the phrase protest movement, I think you called it. I think we have lost, for the most part, mainstream at least, have lost the idea that a protest or boycott or something like that is an element of a bigger movement. It is a manifestation of show of strength for march or protest. It's to show the strength that there's this many people care about this. It is not the purpose of the movement. It is a flashpoint, if you will, or a symbolic action. So I don't have in my mind that there is a such thing as a protest movement, because no one who's organizing is looking to say, how do we organize a protest? It's how do we organize the awareness and the education and the tools and what is needed for people to see the impact that the system is having on them so that they feel motivated to do something about it. And protests do help for that. That's an element of that. Going back to your question, should people do that? Should people work with people who have their hands on the levers of power or whatever to make change? And the reason I say it's binary is because the generic answer is yes, people should do that. But the more nuanced answer that it needs to happen is around the realization not everybody needs to do that.
Yeah.
So there's in that community conversation when we're like, well, what is needed? What are we keeping? What are we getting rid of? What are we building towards? There's going to come a point in time when you're going to be met with multiple different pathways of how people see you can achieve this goal. And I think because of whatever teachings, whatever come from that we have on a broad stroke statement, it usually falls into that binary of like, well, we have to do this one thing. If you're not doing this one thing, then you're not actually helping the cause. And it creates a division within the community. So the question is really looking at if there are multiple paths that are showing up that people want to do. It's not a question of like, well, that one's better, that one's bad, that one's okay, that one let's get rid of. It's how do we have a conversation of like, how do all of these things become part of our strategy? How do we organize so that when we are in conversations with the politicians, with the people who have hands, on the lever of power, that we're making the greatest impact versus the people who say, no, we actually need to start building, if we're going to get universal health care and we're building the infrastructure. So when they pull that away from us, I think we need to start actually building community hospitals and community systems of care or whatever, that when this system goes away, we're still here. We still have the things. It doesn't become it's either this or that. It's a both and. It's like, how do we support the community in developing those two things at the same time, or those three things, or whatever it may be. I think we do get in a trap often that, I think we even talked about it on the previous episode. We get in a trap not really understanding and seeing that two things can be true at the same time. And how do we nurture that? How do we actually see that clearly so that we take the proper steps forward? Because we don't see that. I mean, even the way we talk about things, the way we look at things, for the most part, is in that individualistic or that binary. It's either, like we said before, it's either Republican or Democrat, and then within that, it's like, no, we got Republican, Democrat, and Independent, but nothing changed in that. So it's like, where's the conversations that take us out of that binary?
I think that's a fair point. There's more, I guess, we could say, but we are approaching that hour mark. So I guess I want to see, do we have any closing thoughts, fellas? Again, I'm just putting out my own story here in terms of how my mind has shifted on these issues and how I'm still a work in progress. So I myself have questions about how to do this well, and I have different ways that I kind of view my own life in terms of in my job and daily practice, my relationships, where I try to advocate for justice if and when I can, but it's still in some ways it's still very ill-formed, because I'm kind of finding new ground for my own feet, because for a long time, like I said, it was Anabaptism was my, like, I had an ideology and it was pretty strong, and so now it's a bit more fluid. So Muoki, any final thoughts here?
I mean, look, I hope I didn't come in too hot, but I think it was something you said a few conversations ago about how you think about possibly entering into places where, you're not all thinking the same thing and kind of trying to have influence there. And that stuck out to me, because I never think that kind of a way. And I think you just have courage, particularly with your story and everything that you've been through. I think you have a level of courage and a sense of urgency that's really commendable. And I mean that just, as someone who, you're a deep thinker. And I think that's just like, we need people like you who have that tenacity to think really hard and be also willing and able to enter into places where you can advocate for your views in a place that has, perhaps you say, like a dominant dissenting opinion, even if it's an aggressive one. So I just want to tell you, because at the time I didn't say it, but I felt it, but I didn't know how to articulate it. So I just wanted to say that right now. And the other bit is, I think about, some of in the New Testament, there are these examples of, these influential people that have these big old houses where the people could meet and have churches. So it's that both end. I think there's a way that having access to influential figures to at least advance the cause, even if it may not necessarily be advancing social change in a policy kind of a way, at least instantiating some of the stuff that we want to see is really cool. And there's a scriptural basis for that. There is one thing I do that I didn't make a note of somewhere here. It was about the Bonhoeffer moment. And because for me, like, the way the Metaxas has bastardized this concept, which is an important one, and even for your own sake, is at the time, Bonhoeffer's thing was no one cared about the Jews in the state church. And so supporting the Jewish community was essentially supporting the most marginalized community. This was like the bottom of the barrel. And I think for me, what I love so much about Bonhoeffer is he was just so perceptive to latch on to this idea of what does it mean to be connected to an extremely marginalized community in a theological way. And really just kind of go all in on that and just take it as far as it goes. And so there's a Bonhoeffer moment, but I think in his life it was like there were moments where he had to make these decisions over and over again. And I think that's why it's so powerful. And I think in the conversations that we're having, I think, Jason, about your work with reasonable guidance, just all those different stories I see there, so many moments that we have to decide that we're going to do the very difficult. I mean, I think, Jason, you talk about like, liberation is one thing for me and it's not the same thing for everybody else. And like, you have to do a lot of work to like figure out how does liberation work for like all these different people in a way that advances liberation for all of us in different ways. That's not easy. And to make it work and even instantiate it even a little bit for the people that really matter, you have to, you can't be half in, half out. And Matt, your stories is awesome. I've really enjoyed the last few conversations we've had, just thinking about our own stories and even just how to make things happen in the real world. So, really appreciate you guys kind of going hard and really working and really helping even me just understand even, liberation in some really cool ways.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt.
Indeed.
Yeah. Thank you, friends, for tuning in to listen to 35 to 40 plus men talk about 40 plus. I mean, we're over 40, right? Like, Muoki, you're under 40, right?
36, so I'm getting there. I'll be there.
I said mid-30s to 40.
Yeah, I got my ticket.
I almost said a bunch of white dudes talking about justice, and then because
I don't think
sometimes I'm like, wait, that doesn't work. That's not true. Like, yeah, no. So thank you, friends, for listening to us, possibly for the last time. If you have questions for us, you can send them to onequestionpodcast1q@gmail.com, or you can comment on YouTube or anywhere else you have found this podcast. Please like and subscribe if you're listening wherever you are listening, and consider leaving us a review if you like what you hear. Well, thank you, friends. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.
See you guys.